Good evening. I would like to thank everybody that's here, and I would like to thank those of you that are viewing at home on YouTube. We very much appreciate you being here for this storytelling time. My name is Larry Temple, and I will be telling the first story. In 1952, my father graduated from college at the age of 35. He had gone to school on the GI Bill. He had 3 children at home, myself and my 2 older sisters. He took a job at Lake Zurich, Illinois, which is about 40 miles northwest of Chicago, not far from the Wisconsin border. His family was all from Wisconsin. Now, the first thing they did when my father took the job at Ela Vernon High School was they made him the freshman class sponsor. Fast forward 3 years, and what was the freshman class is now going to be the senior class. It's August, and traditionally they went on a senior class trip by train from Chicago to the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. They saw the nation's capital and then came back by train. So they were scheduled to leave early Monday morning. And that Saturday, just prior to it, saw our family loaded up and headed north so my parents could get rid of us kids for a week with who else? Relatives. We started out from Lake Zurich, Illinois. We drove about an hour north to Milwaukee. My Aunt Mavis, my father's youngest sister, lived there. Aunt Mavis was the black sheep of the family. She had been raised strict Methodist, but had made the mistake of falling in love with Peter Musio, who was an Italian Catholic. Now, the 3 big sins in the Methodist Church at that time were smoking, drinking, and marrying a Catholic. Now, everybody knew that not only had she married a Catholic, but the Catholics celebrated communion with real wine, so she was drinking alcohol. And not only that, but Uncle Pete smoked. So Aunt Mavis had committed the trifecta of Methodist sins. We arrived at Aunt Mavis's. She had 3 daughters. There was Paula and Susan. They were close to the age of my next oldest sister, Jan. Paula was 3 minutes older than Susan. Never let her forget that. Now, Paula was known as the wild one. And when we got there, my parents immediately wanted to go see New Baby Maryland. Us kids weren't interested in New Baby Maryland. We went outside and we played. And I don't think it was 10 minutes after we got outside, Paula, the wild one, unbuttoned the front of her dress and opened it up and showed me something I had never seen before. Her belly button was an Audi. I had never seen an Audi before. My sisters were all innies. My parents were innies. All my friends were innies. Paula opened up her dress. She also was an Audi. I couldn't wait to get inside. We got inside. I lifted the cover of New Baby Maryland, and sure enough, she was an Audi also. What did this all mean? Well, it wasn't long. My parents wanted to get on the road. We left my sister Jan there, drove an hour north to Neenah, Wisconsin, where my dad's oldest sister, Gladys, lived with Uncle Ken and their 5 children. Now, the 4th oldest children was Karen, and she was close to the age of my sister Judy. Judy would spend the week with them. As soon as we got there, Karen and Judy wanted to play their favorite game, which was school. They were the teachers, and my poor cousin Kenny and I were the students. They taught us spelling. My sister loved spelling. Actually, it was quite educational because I learned to sound out words by their letters. I learned to spell that way. Then they went on to some higher spelling, how to turn singulars into plurals and all this stuff. And luckily, my parents wanted to get on the road. So we loaded up in the car and headed north, about 40 miles north of Green Bay, Wisconsin, to a small town called Oconto Falls. Immediately after we got in the car, my mother started giving me the talk. She said, don't pick your nose. Grandma hates it when you pick your nose. She said, don't scratch yourself. I said, Grandpa scratches himself. Mom said, it's his house. He can do what he wants to. You can't. I said, why not? She said, because I said so. She said, don't be picky with your food. And whatever you do, don't tell them that I'm going to have a baby. And I said, why not? She said, because I'm not. She said, now Aunt Maud is going to be there. And I knew Aunt Maud. Aunt Maud was my grandma's oldest sister. She was the oldest of 8 children. She'd never married. She was a very austere woman, stood very erect and looked down her nose at you over these glasses. She wore dark black dresses, and her shoes had just a long row of buttons on them. She said, don't talk back to Aunt Maud. She said, Aunt Maud knows everything there is about raising children. I said, she does? And my mom said, yes, that's because she never had any. All the way to Oconto Falls, my mother drilled me on what I wasn't supposed to do and what I could do. We got there about supper time. We sat down, we ate supper with Grandma and Grandpa. My dad visited about the people in town. He'd grown up there. And after supper, my parents said, we're going to turn in early. We're going to get up early in the morning. We're going to drive back and have a good part of the day to pack and get ready for those 42 hormone-enhanced high school seniors. They turned in. As they started for the bedroom, my grandma says, I bet it'll feel lonely in that car without the children. And my mom said, it will be heaven. They went to bed, we watched a little bit of TV, and then we went to bed. And it was the first time at my grandparents' that I had had a room all to myself. And it was kind of lonely. I woke up the next morning. My parents had already left. It was Sunday. Ate breakfast, got ready. We went to church. They worshiped at the First Methodist Church of Oconto Falls. My Aunt Maud, my great Aunt Maud was there, and she had a solo that day. Well, she had a solo every day. In fact, she had a solo every time they sang a hymn. She had this strong contralto voice that would sing about the old rugged cross, and when the roll is called up yonder, and bringing in the sheaves. When church was over, Aunt Maud walked back home with us. She was going to have Sunday dinner at our house. Grandma got dinner on the table. We sat down, we prayed, we started eating. We had no sooner started eating than Aunt Maud turned to me and she said, young Lawrence. See, my father was Lawrence, so I was also Lawrence. I was young Lawrence. Young Lawrence, how are your parents? I said, they're fine. I'm not supposed to tell you that my mom's going to have a baby. Aunt Maud and Grandma immediately perked up. And Aunt Maud said, why not? And I said, because she isn't. Well, Aunt Maud then said, young Lawrence, how are you doing in school? I can tell you how to do much better. And I said, oh, that would be great. My mom says you know everything about raising kids. She said, she does? And I said, yes, she says that's because you never had any. Aunt Maud started to turn pink. My grandma was trying to hide a smile behind the napkin, and my grandfather was choking on some peas and carrots. Well, Aunt Maud was kind of quiet for the rest of the meal, never said much. We ate dessert. She got up to help Grandma do the dishes. Grandma always did the dishes immediately after the meal. And when she got done, I could hear them back in the kitchen. I heard words like obstreperous and unruly, and he needs discipline. My grandfather and I went out into the living room, and he started telling me stories. Oh, I loved his stories of him growing up near the Oconto River with his brothers hunting and fishing, about the things they would do on the farm. Aunt Maud left as soon as the dishes were done. Grandma came out, and I realized there was kind of a censorship that they had arranged. If Grandma didn't mind the story, she said nothing, and Grandpa would tell it. If Grandma said, "Papa," it meant she didn't approve of the story, but he could tell it anyway. But if she said, "Herbert," that was it. He had to quit right there. He started to tell me a story about this man that had a glass eye, and he put it in his mouth and accidentally swallowed it, and Grandma said, "Herbert." It was 14 years before I ever learned how that story concluded. Well, we watched a little TV, and then Sunday night we went to bed. And I woke up Monday morning ready to spend the day with my grandfather. But he was gone. I said, "Grandma, where's Grandpa?" She said, "Oh, it's green bean season in Oconto Falls. And when it's green bean season, they start up the old steam canner." Now, your grandfather used to run the steam engine at the old paper mill before it shut down and turned to electricity. And he's the only one in the area that knows how to run the steam canner. So they always use him when the garden produce starts to come in and need to be canned. I said, "When's he going to get home?" She said, "Oh, he'll be home about supper time." That seems so long for me. But Grandma had gone out in the morning. She'd gotten bowls of green beans and garden produce from my grandpa's garden, and she was canning it. I had 3 important jobs that I had to do to help her. Number 1, I'd take those strike anywhere matches, and I'd light it, and I'd hold it next to the burner of the old gas stove. Grandma would turn on the gas valve, and it would go rip, and the burner would be on. My other important job is Grandma took the jars out of the canner, put them on a towel to cool, and when those tops popped down, I had to say, "Grandma, this one popped down," and show her which one so she'd know. The other important job I had was to turn on the light to go down into the cellar below the house where Grandpa had built rows and rows of wooden shelves for rows and rows of mason jars filled with all kinds of canned goods. We canned most of the afternoon, and finally, about supper time, Aunt Maud showed up again. She went into the kitchen talking to Grandma. Grandma said, "I think it's about time." I ran outside, and here came Grandpa down Washington Street in the old Model A 1929 Model A. He bought brand new and drove clear until the late 50s when he quit driving. He came down Washington Street. I waved. He went, "Arr, arr." He turned the corner into the garage. Came out of the garage, closed the doors. I grabbed his hand. We walked up to the front porch. He let go of my hand, grabbed Grandma in a hug, said, "Hello, mater, my little tomato," and she always did the same thing. She pushed him away and said, "Herb, not in front of the child." We went inside, and Aunt Maud was sitting at the table. Now, we said our prayer. We started eating, and Aunt Maud turned to me, and she said, "Young Lawrence, I want you to make me some promises." My grandma looked kind of concerned, but she never said anything. She said, "Young Lawrence, promise me that you'll never smoke." Well, my grandpa didn't smoke, and my dad didn't smoke, and Hattie Hoheisel, the next door neighbor, would come over, and when she smoked, she'd light one cigarette with the one that was going out, and it just made our house smell bad. It was an easy promise. I said, "I promise." She said, "Young Lawrence, promise me you'll never drink alcohol." Well, my grandpa didn't drink alcohol. My dad didn't drink alcohol. I loved the taste of Kool-Aid. It was an easy promise. I said, "I promise." And then she said, "And young Lawrence, promise me that you'll never marry a Catholic." And I heard my grandma under her breath say, "Oh, for goodness sake." Now, that was a little harder promise. I figured when I got older, if my mom didn't marry me, I was going to marry Sharon Moss. She was the older sister of 2 of my really good friends, Tim and Steve Moss. And she was beautiful, and she was always nice to me when I went over there, and I would marry her, but she was Catholic. So I hesitated, and Aunt Maud said to me, "Young Lawrence, promise me you'll never marry a Catholic." And again, I hesitated. She said, "Young Lawrence, "Do you know the difference between Catholics and Protestants?" And I thought, and I said, "Yes, I do. Catholics have outies for belly buttons." Aunt Maud turned pretty scarlet, and she never said anything for the rest of the meal. And then she left fairly quickly, didn't even help my grandma with the dishes. My grandpa and I went out into the living room. We watched a little TV, and then it was time to go out to the garden. He picked a lot of stuff and put it in a bowl. I was going to help. They didn't like what I picked. And they didn't like what I stepped on when I walked in the garden. So they said, "You can help us best by standing at the edge of the garden and holding the bowl." And I did. Well, as soon as enough was picked for Grandma to can the next day, he said, "Sit down here and I'll tell you stories as I weed the garden." Now, Grandpa's garden was something like out of Better Homes and Gardens. All the rows were perfectly straight, the plants just perfectly spaced. You could tell exactly what was planted there. I sat down and Grandpa started telling me stories, and the next thing I knew, I woke up in my bedroom. It was Tuesday morning. Tuesday was pretty much like the other days, except that afternoon, Grandma needed to go to the grocery store. She needed canning lids and some other supplies. She had this little wire basket with 2 wheels on it. It had a handle. I got to pull that basket all the way downtown and all the way back, about 5 blocks each way. She kept telling me how strong I was. I didn't realize until later she told me that so that she didn't have to pull it. We went to the Piggly Wiggly. We went to the Red Owl. We went to the Jewel Tea, and when we were done with the groceries, we went to the Ben Franklin 5 and dime. Grandma gave me a whole quarter to spend as I wanted to. Oh, I went up and down the aisles of candy trying to make up my mind. I went up and down the aisles of toys, and finally I bought 2 little cars, 11 cents each. And for 3 cents, if you were smart, you got 6 pieces of candy instead of 3. We went home. I played with my cars for the evening, for most of the afternoon, and Grandma said, "It's about time." I went outside. Grandpa was coming down Washington Street. I waved, "Arrrah, arrrah," into the garage, closed the garage doors. I grabbed his hand up to the porch. He hugged Grandma. "Hello, Mater, my little tomato," and she said, "Herb, not in front of the child," and we went inside. Now, Aunt Maud was not there that evening, and I commented, I said, "I wonder where Aunt Maud is." Grandpa said something about her meeting her match. I didn't know what that meant. Well, we ate supper, after supper, a little bit of TV. Grandpa loved, according to Grandma, the shoot-'em-up westerns. There was a fiery horse, and there was as fast as light, a cloud of dust, and a mighty hi-yo silver. Gene Autry was back in the saddle again. Roy Rogers and Dale Evans sang Happy Trails to us. But the favorite show of my grandpa was Gunsmoke. There was Chester, and he would go, Mr. Dillon, with his stiff leg. After the TV, we went back out into the garden. We picked bowls full, and Grandpa sat me on the side, and he began weeding in that garden again. And the next thing I knew, I woke up, and it was Wednesday morning. Wednesday, I helped Grandma again, and it was just pretty much like the other days. But when supper time came, came Aunt Maud. And she was kind of giving me a little wider berth now. She went into the kitchen. They were talking. Grandma said, "I think it's about time." Ran outside, into the garage, closed the garage door, take Grandpa's hand up onto the porch. "Hello, Mater, my little tomato, Herb, not in front of the child." And we went inside. We had Brussels sprouts that night. I didn't particularly like Brussels sprouts, but I couldn't be picky. We started, everybody got served. Aunt Maud took her fork, speared a Brussels sprout, came up. I thought she was going to put it in her mouth. At the last second, she stopped. And she turned to my grandma and she said, "Ella May, do you know that the Marquardt girl, who was only married almost a year ago, is already Pregnant. And she put the Brussels sprout in her mouth. And I said, well, that spells pregnant. And when I said that, Aunt Maud inhaled, and I think that Brussels sprout went down her throat because she got this wild, almost helpless look on her face. I said, that means she's going to have a baby. And Aunt Maud coughed, and that Brussels sprout came out, cleared the table, onto the floor, and rolled clear into the kitchen. And I thought, man, I wish I could spit a Brussels sprout like that. I said, Aunt Maud, my sister Judy taught us how to make babies. Aunt Maud was a deer in the headlights. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. Her eyes were wide. She was terrified. I said, it's easy. You just change the Y to I and add ES. My grandfather choked on his Brussels sprout, and my grandmother was trying really hard to hide that smile behind her napkin. But Aunt Maud never recovered that meal. She didn't have much of an appetite after that, excused herself early. We finished our meal, had our dessert, and Grandpa and I went out and watched some TV while Grandma washed the dishes. Then out to the garden, and the usual. He'd pick a bunch of stuff, and then he'd weed while I listened to his stories. And I woke up the next morning. It was Thursday. Thursday was much like the other days. Finally, Grandma said, I think it's about time. I went out, into the garage, closed the garage door, hand in hand up to the porch. Grandma, hello, Mater, my little tomato. Grandma, Herb, not in front of the child. I finally noticed that even though she knew what he was going to do, she waited until she got her hug before she pushed him away. So anyway, we went inside and ate, and my grandfather was just a different person at supper when Aunt Maud wasn't there. He was alive, he was joking, he was laughing, he was almost flirting with Grandma to the point that Grandma gave him a look. Yeah. Supper was over, we watched some TV, went out to the garden, and I fell asleep listening to my grandfather's stories again. I woke up Friday morning, and I got to thinking, my grandfather worked so hard at that canner every day. And then he comes home, and he has just a little bit of time to eat supper and watch a little bit of TV, and then he has to go out and work in his garden. We have never all week gone to the Tasty Freeze. The Tasty Freeze was only about 3 blocks away. It served 2 flavors, vanilla and chocolate. People were satisfied with that back then. And I said, maybe if I help him in his garden today, we'll have time to go to the Tasty Freeze tonight. So I went to the garden shed, and I got the hoe, and I went out to the garden, and I wasn't sure which were the weeds and which were the good plants, but I figured if I got them all, by golly, I'd get those weeds. And I started going. I was working like a fury. Grandma happened to look out the kitchen window. She saw me. She came running out after about 15 minutes. And she said, what are you doing? And I said, I'm helping Grandpa. He works so hard at that canner, and he never has time to take us to the Tasty Freeze. He's probably so tired and so busy. And we haven't gone to the Tasty Freeze, and I just wanted to help him in his garden so we could. She put her arm around me, took the hoe away, and said, I think you've helped him enough. We went inside, and I couldn't wait. All afternoon, I just waited and waited and waited. I couldn't wait for my grandpa to get home to show how I'd helped him. Just before supper, Aunt Maud showed up. She said, Ella May, what happened in Herb's garden? My grandma said, well, he got some help today. That's all she said. And they went in the kitchen. She stuck her head out of the kitchen. She said, I think it's about time. I ran outside, into the garage, closed the door. I grabbed my grandfather's hand. I said, Grandpa, I have a surprise for you. I have a surprise for you. I helped you today. And he said, yes, yes. And he walked up, and he put his arms around Grandma, and he said, hello, Mater, my little tomato. And she pushed him away. She said, Herb, You remember whatever you say to him now today, he will remember for the rest of his life. And she turned and walked into the house, and my grandpa stood there in shell shock. He turned to me and he said, "What were you saying earlier?" I said, "Grandpa, Grandpa," and I grabbed his hand and I pulled him around to the back of the house. And I said, "See?" And he went down on one knee so that one knee was up, and he put me on that knee, and I could feel that his body was shaking. And he said, "Why did you do this?" And I said, "Well, Grandpa, you work so hard all day at the canner, and then you come home and you just have a little bit of time for supper and TV, and then you have to work in your garden again. And I thought if I helped you in your garden, we'd have time to go to the Tasty Freeze." And he put his arms out and around me, and he squeezed me, well, kind of hard. And he said, "Well, thank you very much." And he stood up and he took my hand and we walked around. And when we came in the front door, Aunt Maud was standing there. And she said, "Herbert, you saw what he did in your garden?" And Grandpa said, "Yes, I saw." She said, "Herbert, you know what you have to do. The Bible says, spare the rod and spoil the child." And for the first and only time, my grandfather stood up straight. He looked her straight in the eye, and he said, "What I have to do, I've already done. And if you don't like it, you're not welcome to supper tonight." Aunt Maud got very quiet. We sat down. Nobody said a word at supper. She didn't eat a thing. She left probably 10 minutes after supper started. She said she didn't really have much of an appetite that night. We finished our supper, and Grandma got up to go get dessert. And Grandpa stood up and took her hand and said, "Ella May, my grandson helped me in my garden today so that we have time to go to the Tasty Freeze tonight. Would you do the honor of accompanying us?" And Grandma looked him in the eyes and smiled and said, "I would be proud to." We went straight to the front door. Grandma did not clear the table. She did not wash the dishes. We went right to the front door. I grabbed my grandfather's hand, and the 3-block walk to the Tasty Freeze and back, I don't think my feet touched the pavement once. The next day, when my parents came, my grandpa bragged how I had helped him in his garden. Now, it would be years before I realized what I had really done out there. And it would also be years before I heard the love passage from 1 Corinthians 13, where it says, "Love is patient, love is kind, love does not rejoice in evil, but rejoices in the truth." It says, "Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things." And then concludes with, "And now these 3 abide, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love." When I heard that passage, I didn't need to have it explained to me because my grandfather had modeled it. Thank you very much. Would you like to introduce yourself? Okay. I'm Larry Temple, as I said earlier. This is Jay Goering. And we wanted to do something special in the way of storytelling. Jesus was a storyteller. He was a superstar storyteller. He was a man that could draw audiences of 4,000 and 5,000 people. He taught in parables. And what parable means is simply a parable is a story that is laid beside something else.
So tonight, we are going to take two stories and lay them side by side.
The scriptures that I will tell come from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, selected scriptures where Peter denies Christ.
And the story I will use is the poem Casey at the Bat by Ernest Lawrence Thayer.
Simon, Simon, listen. Satan has demanded to sift all of you like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail, and when once you have turned back, you may strengthen your brothers.
It looked extremely rocky for the Mudville Nine that day. The score stood 2-4 with but one inning left to play.
Peter said, Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death. Jesus said, Peter, truly I tell you, this very night, before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter said, Lord, though all become deserters because of you, I will not. Just then, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, and with him was a large crowd with clubs and swords. And all of them, his disciples, deserted him and fled.
So when Cooney died at second, and Burroughs did the same, a pallor wreathed the features of the patrons of the game.
Peter had said, though all desert you, I will not.
A straggling few got up to go, leaving there the rest, with hope that burns eternal within the human breast. For they thought if only Casey could get a whack at that, they'd put even money down with Casey at the bat.
His disciples, every one of them, had deserted him and fled.
A scattered few got up to go, leaving there the rest, with hope that burns eternal within the human breast. But we're doing this again. The problem was that with it seemed but little chance that Casey would get to the bat.
They took Jesus to the high priest.
But Flynn preceded Casey, and likewise so did Blake. The former was a puddin', and the latter was a fake. So on that stricken multitude, a death-like pallor sat, for there seemed but little chance of Casey getting to the bat.
And Jesus stood before the high priest.
But Flynn let fly a single, to the wonderment of all, and the much-despised Blake tore the cover off the ball. And when the dust had lifted, and you could see what had occurred, there was Blakey safe at second, and Flynn a hugging third. Then from that gladdened multitude went up a joyous yell. It rumbled in the mountaintops, it rattled in the dell. It bounced against the hillside and rebounded in the flat. For Casey, mighty Casey, was advancing to the bat.
Peter had followed at a distance. He was sitting by the guards at the fire, warming himself.
There was ease in Casey's manner as he stepped into his place. There was pride in Casey's bearing and a smile on Casey's face. And when acknowledging the crowd, he lightly doffed his hat, no stranger in the crowd could doubt 'twas Casey at the bat.
One of the servant girls of the high priest went by, and when she saw Peter, she stared at him.
10,000 eyes were on him as he rubbed his hands with dirt. 5,000 tongues applauded as he wiped him on his shirt. And when the writhing pitcher ground the ball into his hip, defiance gleamed in Casey's eye, a sneer curled Casey's lip.
She said, "You were with him, the man from Nazareth." But he denied it, saying, "I don't know what you were talking about."
The leather-covered spheroid came hurtling through the air, but Casey stood watching it in haughty grandeur there. Close by the sturdy batsman, the ball unheeded sped. "That ain't my style," said Casey.
He actually said, "I don't know what you were talking about."
"Strike one," the umpire said. From the benches black with people went up a muffled roar like the raging of some storm wave against some stern and distant shore. "Kill him! Kill the umpire!" someone shouted from the stand, and it's likely they'd have done it had not Casey raised his hand. With a smile of Christian charity, great Casey's visage shone. He stemmed the rising tumult. He bade the game go on. He signaled to the pitcher, and once more the spheroid flew. But Casey still ignored it.
When he went out onto the porch, another servant girl of the high priest went by, and she turned and said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." But Peter swore an oath, saying, "I do not know this man."
And the umpire said, "Strike two." "Fraud!" cried the maddening thousands, and the echo sounded, "Fraud!" But one stern look from Casey, and the audience was awed. They saw his face go stern and cold. They saw his muscles strain, and they knew that Casey wouldn't let that ball go by again. The sneer is gone from Casey's lip. His teeth are clenched with hate. He pounds with very vengeance his bat upon the plate. And now the pitcher has the ball, and now he lets it go.
While he was on the porch, some of the bystanders came up and said, "You are one of them, for your accent betrays you." But Peter began to curse, and he swore an oath, and he denied it, saying,
And the air was certainly shattered by the force of Casey's blow.
"Damn! I give you my word, I do not know this man." Just then, the cock crowed, and Jesus turned and looked at him.
Somewhere in this favored land, the sun is shining bright. Bands are playing somewhere, and somewhere hearts are light. Somewhere men are laughing, and somewhere children shout. But there is no joy in Mudville. Mighty Casey has struck out.